In the Sarajevo siege, approximately 13,000 people died, but 400,000 survived, 44 months. No electricity, no running water, snipers on the rooftops. Food measured in grams per day, not calories. The math on survival should have been catastrophic. It wasn't. And the gap between the 13,000 and 400,000 was not explained by who had the better bug-out bag. That's the threat. Here's the promise. I'm going to show you the exact behavioral profile that separated the people who made it from the people who didn't. One profile, consistent across Sarajevo, Venezuela, post-Katrina New Orleans, the Argentina 2001 collapse, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And then I'm going to show you its mirror image, the personality type that doesn't just fail to survive, but actively degrades the survival chances of every person near them. I spent 8 months inside the documented accounts. Survivor testimonies, military resilience assessments on civilian populations, 60 years of disaster behavior research out of the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center. The people who study how humans actually behave in disasters, not how we imagine we will. I was looking for the gear list. I did not find a gear list. What I found was a behavioral fingerprint. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The research I'm pulling from isn't gentle. Judith Herman's trauma response data from conflict zones. Rebecca Solnit's documented disaster behavior patterns across 20th century catastrophes. Israeli Defense Forces psychological resilience studies on communities under active siege conditions. The University of Delaware dataset running from 1963 to present. One finding cuts across all of it like a knife. In every documented long-term collapse scenario, the survival rate for the best equipped person in the room was lower than the survival rate for the most connected person in the room. Not better armed, not better supplied, most connected. That sentence lands differently depending on how you've been preparing. Let it settle. Let me tell you about a man named Vedran. He lived in Sarajevo, cellist, city orchestra. When the siege started, his apartment became the gathering point for his floor of the building. Not because he had the most food, he didn't. Not because he had weapons, he had a kitchen knife and a genuine inability to use it on another human being. He became the center of his building's survival network because he did 5 specific things. And those 5 things are not traits you're born with. They are behaviors. They are trainable. They map almost exactly to what the disaster literature identifies as the profile of a long-term survivor. So, let's build the profile. Behavioral signature 1. Flexible goal revision. This sounds like corporate training material. It is not corporate training material. Here's what it actually looks like in the field. When the plan fails, and the plan always fails. Every time, without exception. The plan encounters reality and reality does not cooperate. The survivor does not freeze. They revise in real time, within hours, and they execute the revised plan without performing grief over the original one. Researchers call this adaptive appraisal under acute uncertainty. I call it not being precious about being right. Walk yourself through your own bug-out plan right now. You've got a route, a location. A bag, probably a good one. Now block the route. Your location's already occupied. The bag's in your car and your car won't start. What happens next in your head? Not what you think should happen. What actually happens? If there's even a few seconds of "but that was the plan" before you pivot, you have a vulnerability. Because in Sarajevo, in Caracas, in New Orleans in the summer of 2005, the people who died in the first weeks were frequently people who waited for the situation to become recognizable before they acted. The situation did not become recognizable. It became worse. The freeze cost them hours they did not have. Vedran's version. When the gas was cut, he was cooking over candles within 4 hours. Not because he was a genius. Because he defaulted to working instead of waiting. Monday morning action. Write down your 3 most critical survival plans. Then write down specifically what you do when each one fails catastrophically. Not vaguely, specifically. If Route A is blocked, I take Route B via this road and shelter here. If I can't write a specific action for each failure mode, I don't have a plan. I have an assumption. Behavioral signature 2, the skill broadcast. Here's a sentence that will reframe your prep kit entirely. In a long-term collapse scenario, your skills are more valuable than your supplies because your supplies have an expiration date and your skills do not. Vedran played cello in the ruins of a city. What this actually produced was a gravity well. People came to where he was, regularly, voluntarily, with information, with trades, with early warnings about sniper activity, with connections to other floors, other buildings, other parts of the network. He wasn't just keeping morale alive, though he was absolutely doing that. He was running an intelligence node disguised as a concert. Every person who showed up was a potential source of something he needed, and the mechanism for attracting them was that he was broadcasting a skill that made other people want to be near him. The survivors I found across every collapse account did this. Not always with silos. With repair skills, medical knowledge, agricultural knowledge, mechanical ability, negotiation capacity. The specific skill almost didn't matter. The broadcast did, because the broadcast created network density. And network density is the single most powerful survival multiplier in the documented literature. Here's the part the prepper industry doesn't want to build a product line around. The lone wolf with the deep cache and the hostile perimeter has a single point of failure survival architecture. One ambush, one illness, one fire. That's the whole plan. Gone. The person embedded in a functioning network has redundancy that no amount of gear can replicate. The network is the backup. The network is the intelligence service. The network is the labor force when you're injured, and the medical resource when you're sick, and the protection when you're asleep. Concrete Monday test. What do you know how to do? Write it down specifically. Not I know some first aid. I can suture a laceration. I can treat a fracture. I know which plants in my region are edible. I can purify water using these 3 methods. I can repair an engine. Now do your 5 nearest neighbors know that? Have you told them? The skill isn't in the network yet. It's just in your head, where it helps exactly one person. Go knock on a door this Saturday. Introduce yourself if you haven't. Tell them one thing you know how to do that might matter. Ask what they know. That 8-minute conversation is structurally more valuable than a second case of freeze-dried food, and it costs you nothing but the mildly uncomfortable feeling of talking to a neighbor, which you will survive. Behavioral signature 3. Calibrated trust. The fortress mentality, which I'll dissect in full shortly, is the most lethal mistake I documented across the collapse literature. But the survivor's alternative to it is worth isolating here, because from a distance it can look similar. It is not similar. The difference is the mechanism. The survivor doesn't trust everyone. They're not naive idealists wandering into collapse scenarios with open arms and a positive attitude about human nature. What they do is assess trust the way a careful trader assesses credit, incrementally through small tests. With a running ledger, you give someone something small, information, a minor favor, a low-cost demonstration of goodwill. You watch what they do with it. You adjust your model of that person accordingly. If they reciprocate, you give slightly more access. If they don't, you note it and hold your position. The trust either grows through demonstrated behavior or it doesn't. You never bet everything on a single assessment. This process compresses dramatically under stress. Humans are extraordinary readers of other humans when the stakes are real. We've been doing it for 200,000 years, and we got very good at it because the failures were fatal. The survivors used this capacity. The people who didn't make it ran one of 2 alternative strategies. Trust everyone immediately, or trust no one at all. Both kill you. The first gets you robbed. The second leaves you isolated. And isolated in a collapse scenario is a slow execution with comfortable furniture, right up until the moment it isn't comfortable anymore. You can practice calibrated trust now. The next person who enters your professional or social life, run the small test. Give them something modest. Watch carefully. You're not being paranoid. You're maintaining a skill set that will matter enormously and that will atrophy if you don't use it. Behavioral signature 4. Emotional regulation under sustained stress, not fearlessness. Regulation. The distinction matters enough that I want to spend a minute on the biology. Under acute stress, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that handles planning, language, complex decision-making, and moral reasoning, goes partially offline. Blood flow redirects. The amygdala gets louder. You go reactive. This is survival appropriate for roughly 90 seconds of acute threat. You don't need to write a business proposal when a bear is charging you. After 90 seconds, if the threat is ongoing and complex, that same neurological state becomes a liability. Your heart rate is still elevated. Your thinking is still compressed into binary options. And the situation in front of you requires nuanced assessment that your partially hijacked prefrontal cortex is currently terrible. The survivors had systems for coming back, not therapy systems. Behavioral ones. Predictable physical sequences that their nervous systems had learned to associate with the signal. Threat passed, return to planning mode. Vedran played cello. Not mystical, neurological maintenance. A complex memorized piece requires focused prefrontal engagement. The hands manage the task. The brain comes back online. His neighbors called it calming. It was actually neurological recalibration, a drug-free cortisol management protocol that costs nothing and takes 20 minutes. What's your version? Don't say, I'll figure it out under pressure. That is not a plan. That is a gamble on a neurological process you have never practiced. Pick something with a beginning, a defined process, and a predictable end. Knife sharpening. A specific physical drill. Making a fire from scratch. Something that requires focused attention and produces a tangible result. Do it now, regularly, until your nervous system learns the sequence. Then it works when you actually need it to. Behavioral signature 5. Information prioritization over confirmation. The survivors were systematically biased toward bad news. Not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they understood, consciously or not, that bad news is actionable news, and comfortable news is a sedative. Most people under stress seek information that confirms the existing plan is still viable. The roads are probably fine. The water's probably coming back. This is probably temporary. It feels stabilizing. It is catastrophic. You are choosing comfort over data in an environment where data is the only currency that buys you time. The documented survivors sought out the worst credible information first, because if the road is blocked, they needed to know that this hour, not 3 hours from now when they were halfway to the blockage. If the water source was contaminated, they needed to know today, not 4 days from now when they were symptomatic. If the situation was deteriorating instead of stabilizing, and in a collapse, it is always deteriorating faster than it appears to be. Every hour of denial is an hour of response capacity burned on hope. Your region, your supply chain, your route, your community, force yourself to actively seek out the worst credible interpretation, not to catastrophize. To stress test your plans against realistic inputs instead of optimistic assumptions. Most survival plans are built on optimistic assumptions. The plans that work are the ones that survive pessimistic ones. Let me stop here. Because I can feel the objection forming. You're telling me social skills are survival skills. And I want to dissolve that framing before it calcifies. Social skills are what you deploy at a dinner party to be liked. What I'm describing is something structurally different. This is functional coalition architecture under conditions of extreme resource scarcity. This is the behavioral infrastructure that determines whether 8 people can keep each other alive for 6 months when each of them alone would be dead in 3 weeks. This is not so feat. This is load-bearing. The prepper industry has sold a mythology that moves product beautifully. The lone competent individual against the chaos. The self-sufficient fortress in the hills with a perimeter and a plan. The man, and it is almost always framed as a man, who doesn't need anyone because he has everything. It is a compelling story. It sells tactical gear and freeze-dried food at remarkable margins. It does not sell survival outcomes. In the documented collapse literature, not the fiction, the documentation, that archetype appears in one consistent location, the early casualty list. In the first 72 hours of any disaster, per 6 decades of research, the primary rescue resource is neighbors. Not FEMA, not the Red Cross. Neighbors. The people who respond first with the most accurate situational awareness are the people who already know each other, who have already established trust, skill, knowledge, communication patterns, who have been running those calibrated trust tests for years without ever calling it preparedness. You are not preparing for a movie, you are preparing for a documented historical pattern. Adjust what you're building accordingly. I debated how to frame this section, whether to soften it. I decided not to soften it because this personality type doesn't just fail to survive. They are documented as a direct contributing cause of other people's deaths. Being gentle about that feels like the wrong call. I'm calling this the fortress mind. The fortress mind is not a villain in peacetime. In stable conditions, many of these traits look like prudence, or discipline, or foresight. The problem is that collapses are not stable conditions, and every trait that makes this personality functional and predictability becomes a liability, sometimes a lethal one, in its absence. Fortress Signature 1, Hoarding with Secrecy. The fortress mind accumulates, systematically, obsessively, and in secret. Deep pantry, ammunition cache, medical supplies, water reserves. On paper, this looks like preparation. In practice, inside a collapse scenario, it is a social accelerant pointed in exactly the wrong direction. Here's the mechanism. In a resource-scarce environment, information about resource distribution travels fast through social networks. It has always done this. Even in pre-modern scarcity situations, communities developed sophisticated informal intelligence networks about who had what. The person who is visibly accumulating while others are visibly suffering becomes a target. The fortress mind's secrecy, which feels like protection, actually compounds the threat, because secrecy signals that something worth hiding exists. You can't advertise scarcity through behavior, and then expect people not to make accurate inferences. More critically, the refusal to participate in reciprocal exchange removes the fortress mind from the coalition entirely. They become a network node with no active connections. The flow of early warnings, mutual aid, traded skills, and distributed intelligence that keeps the network alive routes around them. They have supplies. They have no intelligence. They have no backup. And when something goes wrong, illness, structural failure, an ambush at 3 a.m., they face it without the one thing that would have mattered most. The documented Sarajevo accounts show a consistent pattern. People who were robbed were overwhelmingly people who had been identified as hoarders. Sometimes accurately, sometimes based purely on rumor generated by behavior patterns that looked like hoarding. The fortress mind's strategy of concealment created the conditions it was designed to prevent. That's not irony. That's a predictable systems outcome. Fortress Signature 2, Threat Inflation. The fortress mind sees enemies in all directions, not because they're clinically paranoid, because their entire preparedness framework is built on a narrative where other people are the primary threat. And here's the dangerous part. That architecture is self-fulfilling. When you build your prep around defending yourself from your neighbors, you treat your neighbors like threats. Neighbors who are treated like threats respond by becoming, at minimum, non-allies. Sometimes actual threats. The fortress mind built the enemy they were afraid of. Here's the uncomfortable statistical reality. In every collapse scenario in the literature, the majority of violence came not from unknown strangers but from existing social contacts. Former neighbors, former business partners, people with pre-existing grievances, and now no institutional mechanism for resolving them. The danger was inside the existing network, not outside it, which means the fortress mind strategy of fortifying against outsiders while poisoning the inside was the exact inverse of what the evidence recommends. The survivor type's calibrated trust model addresses this directly, not by being naive, but by actively managing the social environment they actually face. The fortress mind manages a theoretical external threat while ignoring the internal one they're creating through their own behavior. Fortress Signature 3. Gear fetishism over skill acquisition. I will keep saying this until it lands. A tool you don't know how to use under stress is not a survival asset. It is a donation to whoever takes it from you. The fortress mind's relationship with equipment has a magical quality to it. The gear has properties. The right gear in sufficient quantity produces safety. This belief is how gear gets sold. Worth noting that the entities with the strongest financial interest in your survival preparation are the ones selling you objects, not the ones teaching you capabilities. The problem is that skills are not purchased. They are built through deliberate practice under conditions that simulate stress. Every hour the fortress mind spent researching and acquiring gear was an hour not spent building capability. Every dollar spent on equipment was a dollar not spent on training. I spent months inside the Venezuela accounts. The people who survived on almost nothing were not well equipped. They were extraordinarily capable. They could repair things from parts, grow food from seed, cook nutrition from near-zero ingredient sets, negotiate barter arrangements in a collapsed currency environment, identify edible plants, fix electrical systems with improvised components. They were human Swiss Army knives in an environment that had stripped away every convenience that makes human Swiss Army knives unnecessary. Their skills could not be taken from them. Their supplies could be, and in many cases were. Monday test. Look at your 3 most expensive pieces of gear. When did you last use each one under time pressure, in low light, when you were physically tired? Not in the backyard on a calm afternoon under anything resembling stress. If you can't answer that question, you have inventory, not capability. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where people die. Fortress Signature 4. Rigidity under uncertainty. The fortress mind has a plan. Detailed, practiced, the product of real thought and real effort. The plan is almost certainly wrong in ways that matter. Not because they're unintelligent, frequently the opposite. Because planning for a collapse in advance requires predicting which type of collapse, at what speed, in what sequence, with which actors causing which infrastructure failures. The variable space is not navigable. Contact with reality will break the plan. The question is not whether the plan will fail. The question is, what happens next? The fortress mind's response to plan failure is well documented in disaster psychology research. They intensify commitment to the original plan. They develop explanations for why the evidence of failure is wrong or temporary. They wait for conditions to return to a shape the plan was designed for. This is not stubbornness in the moral sense, it's a cognitive pattern called normalcy bias amplification, and it gets worse under threat, not better. The stronger the pull toward familiar patterns, even when those patterns are demonstrably failing to produce results. In a fast-moving collapse, the difference between a 4-hour revision cycle and a 4-day revision cycle is a body count. That is not rhetorical. That is arithmetic. Fortress Signature 5, the authority compulsion, the fortress mind, has done the research, built the systems, made the plans. When collapse arrives and the people around them are disoriented and frightened, the move is almost irresistible. Take charge. Organize the group. Direct the operation. This is not inherently destructive. Coordination is necessary. Leadership in crises matters. The problem is the specific flavor of authority the fortress mind defaults to. Directive, unilateral, and punishment-based. Give an instruction. Expect compliance. Interpret non-compliance as betrayal. This model functions in exactly 2 environments: military units with existing voluntary hierarchy and formal enforcement mechanisms, and prisons. Neither of which describes your ad hoc neighborhood survival coalition, whose members owe you precisely nothing. Here's what the disaster research shows actually happens. The fortress mind attempts to impose structure. Some people comply initially because structure feels better than chaos, a completely rational response to a terrifying situation. Then the fortress mind makes a decision that harms someone because unilateral decisions under imperfect information always do eventually. That harm breaks compliance. The fortress mind responds by intensifying the authority structure because in their model, hierarchy is the load-bearing element and any crack in it is an existential threat. Others interpret the intensification as coercion. A faction forms. Factions consume resources, attention, and social cohesion that should be going to actual survival problems. The group fractures at exactly the moment it needs to be most coherent. The Argentina 2001 crisis accounts show this pattern with near uncomfortable regularity. The neighborhoods that held together longest were described by participants as horizontal, rotating decision authority, explicit skill-based role allocation, distributed accountability. The neighborhoods that fractured earliest featured a dominant figure who attempted to impose vertical control early. The correlation was consistent enough across accounts that the researchers who documented it described it as structural, not anecdotal. Monday test for this one, and I want you to take it seriously. This week, in a group setting that actually matters to you, work, family, neighborhood meeting, whatever, deliberately defer to someone else's solution when you think you have the better answer. Not as a display of humility, as diagnostic data collection. Notice the strength of the impulse to override. Notice what you tell yourself when you choose not to. That impulse, under 100 times the stress, with real stakes, is the behavior that will determine whether your group holds together or comes apart. Here's what happens when these two profiles share a space in a collapse. Not a movie standoff. An accelerating degradation. The connector reads the fortress mind within days. The hoarding behavior, the hostile perimeter, the rigidity, the authority compulsion, these are all high-signal inputs to a person running constant social calibration. They route around it. They stop including the fortress mind in early warning exchanges. They stop consulting them in decisions. The fortress mind's network connections, already thin, begin to disappear. The fortress mind interprets this as confirmation. The threat they anticipated is materializing. The others are organizing against them. They respond by tightening the perimeter, intensifying the hoarding, attempting to reassert authority over the shrinking circle, which completes the cycle. The group contracts further, the isolation increases, the fortress mind doubles down. What comes next depends on resource advantage. If the fortress mind has enough material leverage to make others dependent, they may survive through coercion for a period. But coerced groups are structurally unstable. They defect when a viable alternative appears. In a sustained collapse, viable alternatives eventually appear. If the fortress mind doesn't have that leverage, if they're just a person with a plan and a hostile perimeter in a neighborhood that has stopped talking to them, the isolation becomes terminal. It is not a story about good people and bad people. It is a story about behavioral profiles that are adaptive in stability and lethal in scarcity. The fortress mind was, in many documented cases, more prepared, more equipped, more planful. They died or caused deaths because the skills that determine survival in a collapse are not the skills being sold to people who want to survive a collapse. Let that sit for a moment and resist the urge to put yourself automatically in the connector column. The fortress mind doesn't think of themselves as the fortress mind. They think of themselves as the one person taking this seriously while everyone around them sleeps. They think of themselves as the connector who had to adapt to an unreliable social environment. The profile is not self-evident from the inside. That's part of what makes it dangerous. Two profiles, documented across a century of collapse. One builds the network that keeps people alive. One eats the network from the inside. You already know which behaviors belong to which. The question is whether you're honest enough to diagnose yourself instead of someone else. Pick one behavior from the survivor profile. Do it before Friday. Not as a hobby. As infrastructure. The viewer who walked in thinking they're prepared, I want you uncomfortable right now. Good. The discomfort is data. Use it.